So here I'm going to show you how to make a script where, say that you have an object in some modeling program and it has some materials on it. What happens if in Unreal we were to just import that object into a folder where its textures live, and it automatically created and attached the materials for you. Perfect. It's all done here through this editor script, a small menu, and here's how you make it. Inside, we're going to be using a checkbox to determine that we want to actually make it, just in case you don't want to. We're going to go over a details view panel where you can put in the varying kinds of materials that you want to attach, and then I'll show you how to do each step of it right over here. We're going to first get the import subsystem, and that's where we're going to grab our objects from. We're going to store those so that way then we can reference them. And then we're going to do a check just to make sure that we even want to automatically create the materials. For each mesh that comes in, we're going to store the materials. Then for each material, we're going to determine a new name based on our naming convention, create a replacement material instance for that material. Then we're going to find the textures that need to go onto that instance, make sure they have the correct settings, and then attach them. Finally, we'll attach the material instance to the static mesh, and then lastly, we'll clean up the directory afterwards. Alright, so the first thing you need to do is make sure that you have the editor scripting utilities plugin enabled. Okay. And the other disclaimer is that in Maya, well, whatever modeling program you're using, you're at least obeying some kind of naming convention. So here I have just a cube with two materials on it, and I have one of them called m_mat_01, and the other one is just mat_02. So either of these for me work because I do a check for both, but make sure that you have some kind of consistency that you can extrapolate from. Alright, so the first thing you're going to do is go to Editor Utilities and create an Editor Utility widget. Now open that up. I'm going to add a vertical box real quick, and we're just going to add a couple of things. Horizontal box. Inside this, we're going to add a checkbox and some text. Cool. And on the text, we'll just put auto material. Then we're going to add a details view, and this is where all of our inputs will go, the kinds of materials that we want to have on it. I'm also going to change it from fill screen to custom, and we'll make it oh so big. Okay, so the details view is going to sit blank for a little while, and we'll come back to that. In the graph here, we need to do a couple of things. I'm going to get rid of these guys. We are going to drag our details view in here. Off of that, say set object, and tie that to the event preconstruct. And then get a reference to self, and plug that in here for new object. Alright, so this will initiate the details view when it's set up. But we're not going to add variables to it or inputs for a little while. So the first thing that we need to do, going back to that graph, or that comment, we need to get the import subsystem. Cool. So this guy will fire grabbing an object each time an object comes into the engine. So we're going to bind this to event construct and unbind it from event destruct. So whenever our window is open, it will pick up the assets that come in. I'm going to create a custom event, call it on asset post import BP event 0. Is it from here? So we want to bind event to on asset post import. And we're going to put our custom event there. And then off of the import subsystem, unbind event from on asset import. on asset post import. Oops. Sometimes this happens and I just have to drag off of the bind. Oh, that's because I'm using the wrong one. Nope, it's the right one. What am I saying? Alright, so here we've gotten the import subsystem, and anytime that this guy fires, it will get whatever the imported object is. We're going to promote that to a variable and label it as imported object. Great. And then another thing that we're going to do is grab our checkbox, and on checked, I'm going to promote the isChecked to a bool saying auto material. And this basically says whenever this, we'll set it up here with a branch that whenever this guy is true, we know that this is the function that we want to perform. All right, so first I'm going to set it all up for a static mesh, and afterwards I'll show you, when we're completely done, the differences that you have to do for a skeletal mesh. I am going to put all of this in a function just to make it convenient. So I will call this sm create and attach material. And afterwards too, we'll talk about some design decisions that you can use to tailor it to your specific needs. All right, so we'll get imported object. Then I'm going to make some local variables here. Automat asset will be 1, and that's just the object that we have inside of this function. Cool. And we will set that to the imported object. We're also going to make an array here called materials for automat asset. And these will be the ones that it imported with. And this is a what happened? Material interface. And we're going to make it an array. So we're going to drag that in, and because this is the start, every time that we perform this, we actually want to clear the arrays. So that way then we don't save the values from the previous object that came in. Now under this guy, I'm going to cast to static mesh. And then here we're going to do a sequence, and our first bit here is basically done. We've just set up some values, casted to the static mesh, so now we can talk to the actor that got imported. And we've set up the import system in the parent graph here. Cool. Alright, so the first thing that we're going to do is actually grab all of the materials that came in with it. So we're going to do a for loop with break. And then off of our static mesh, we're going to get number materials. Fun fact, the tooltip for this is wrong. Alright, so then we're going to for loop with break through the first index being 0 and the last index being the number of materials that we have on the static mesh. This is technically one more than we need, but we're going to do a check to make sure that we don't go over anyways. Alright, so then we're going to get material also off of our static mesh cast. And we're going to plug the index of our for loop with break into that, and we're also going to perform an isValid check. Then off of the loop body, we're going to do a branch. And then here, the array that we made, I'm going to get that and add to it off of the true from our branch. And we're going to use the material that we got off of the static mesh. And then if it's false, oops, not return, I'll plug that into the break. All right, so what we're doing here is we've cast to the static mesh. We're looping through each of the materials. So this will return, say if we have two materials, 0, 1, 2, well, it'll return 2 as a number, and then we're going to loop through the indexes starting at 0. We'll go to 0, then 1, then 2. The material index number starts at 0. So if we have two materials, we'll have index 0 and index 1. Once this hits 2, we're going to do a valid check. That'll return invalid because we're past the number of materials that we have. So false will come through and will break and come out. Otherwise, we will store it here into this array, and now we have an array of all the materials that are on the static mesh to start working with. So I'm going to comment this, store the materials that imported. Cool. All right, so then the next thing that we're going to do is a for each loop. So we can duplicate this guy over. And for each of the materials, we have a few options that we want to do. First, we're going to promote the index to a variable just so we can reference it later. You technically don't have to do that, but it adds to graph readability. And I wanted to do that as a local variable. All right. And then we're going to do a sequence off of this too. For each material, we have a number of things that we want to do. And before I continue, I'm just going to bring up a little document that talks about varying directory types. There's a difference between display name, package path, and package name. Display name will just be the asset name. Path name will be like /game, /directory, subdirectory, finished with asset name dot asset name. And that's important because if we want to rename the materials, we kind of have to do stuff this way. And then the only one that's relevant past that is package name, which is the same as path name, except that it's just the display name at the end. Okay, so off of the material, or the array element from the for each loop with our stored materials, we're going to get display name. And then we're going to do a couple things here. We're going to split. So this next section, we're going to extrapolate the name from the material that it imported with. And then we're also going to do a starts with. All right, so if you remember, here in Maya, my materials are m underscore the material name, and then just the material name. So mat01 and mat02 are the materials. This one had a prefix to it. This is mainly so that way then other people that are working in the project, I'll tell them, as long as you can obey one of these two, if you don't remember the prefix, that's fine. Just make sure that you have the material named the material that it's going to be in Unreal. All right, so off of the first part of our sequence, we're going to do a branch. And then in our starts with, we're going to put m underscore. So if it starts with the prefix that we know that we're supposed to have, then we're going to chop it off. We want to take the display name. Well, we'll make another local variable. Call this print material name. Make it a string and make it not an array. And then I will set it here, and we're going to do 2 of these. Okay, so if it begins with m underscore, I want to remove everything from the start. So here, let's see, I want to use right. It returns everything to the right of the in string. So the in string is the underscore, so we're going to start from the beginning. We'll see M, we'll see underscore, and then we know that the M and the underscore need to come off, so we'll set that. Otherwise, we'll just get the display name, and we'll plug that in. Great. Okay, so we're going to comment this section, get the material name. Okay, so next we're going to do get asset tools. This returns some editor handling that works for the assets in the content browser. And next we're going to set up creating the replacement material. So off of that, you can do create asset, interface call. And then we have our current material name. I'm going to append to it. Now that we have the core name of the material, I can now put mi underscore because I want material instances of my master material to be attached to the object. You can skip this if you want, or set m underscore or whatever kind of prefix you want for your materials that you're generating. Whatever fits your naming convention. If you want the underscore inst at the end, you can do that too. But that'll go into asset name. So now we have package path, which, as I brought up earlier, oh, I lied. This is the one that mattered. So it's /game/ whatever the directory is for the directory that you want to put it in. So there's a really easy way that we can get this. We're going to create a macro real quick, and I'll call it get directory. And then for the only input we need is an object. All right, and then here we will get path name and get display name. Now if I come back to this, the display name for an asset would be the asset name, while the path name will be the directory plus asset name dot asset name at the end. So if we take the display name, we get the length of it. We multiply that by 2, so you get the asset name twice, and add 1 to account for the dot. Then off of the path name, you can do left chop. And this might seem a little counterintuitive because I think that they're named backwards, but it returns the leftmost characters of the string, chopping off the given character from the end. So here we have the length of what the asset name dot asset name would be, and if we plug that in, that will get us just the directory. Pile and save, come back. We will do get directory, and we will plug in the auto material asset that we made earlier. Okay. Then for asset class, you would choose whatever your material or material instance is. I'm going to do material instance, and the subsequent nodes will specifically reference a value that you need to work with material instances in the editor. I have that made here. So I've selected it, and then I can hit no. Oh, asset class is material instance constant. Do not confuse this with material instant. Material instant does not work. You need material instant constant. All right. Promote this to, whoop, not promote. To cast to material instance constant. And I forgot to hook that up there. Make sure that this is all good. Promote to variable. Oops, and again, I want to promote it to a local variable. Call it current replacement mat. Now here we will probably have to drag off the blue pin. Set material instance parent. Alright, so then I also need in full variables, not a local, in the global variables for this blueprint, I need the material that I want to be using. static mesh material will be the new variable name, and this will be also a material instance constant. I'll plug that into the new parent. And then for its value, you just choose whatever you have in your editor that you want to use. So now, if I plug this in, oh, whoops, wrong one, this guy. I made it wrong, that's why. I didn't need to do that. Material instance constant object reference. Now if I do it, there we go. Now it'll show up there. Alright, so this section here is done. Just to recap, get asset tools, create asset. We're going to get the current material name that we had before, put our naming convention in there. This should be, due to the previous section, just the material name. And then we're going to take our asset, get the path name and the display name, and from the path name we will left chop a number of characters that is equal to 2, the display name's length times 2 plus 1. The type for this is material instance constant. We'll cast to it, store that, and then set the parent as this value, which we've predetermined as the material that we want to put in. Now let's say, I'll comment this real quick. Alright, cool. Well, let's say that you want the user to be able to choose what kind of material that they want to put on. So here in our details view, now that we have anything to put into it, I'm going to come back to the graph actually and just copy this guy's name. In a details view, it'll look like what you would normally have in the details panel for Unreal. You have to add a property though. So here is one property. I'm going to paste that value and compile. And I think I'm going to, oh, is it not? Ah, there we go. I need the vertical box to be the size of the whole thing. Alright, so there, now it'll have the input just like in Unreal. I'm also just going to bring my canvas out a bit and the vertical box, make it a bit bigger. Alright, so at this point, if we hit run on our widget, it at least looks like something that we would have in Unreal. And a checkbox here that sets that bool to correct or not. Okay, so real quick, I'm going to try this just as is. So here I have some textures. The base name is mat01, so I have t underscore as the prefix for the texture asset type, and then the type of texture would be underscore base color or BC, normal or N, and we're going to chop those off, or rather we're going to pick those up in a minute. Right now, if I bring this in, I want to set this true first, and then import this guy. We at least make the material. So the material construction up to this point is working. We're just not plugging in textures or assigning them to the material or the static mesh. So that's the next step. All right. So next on our sequence, we're going to get asset registry. This gets a list of all of the assets that you have in your content browser. It loads the list into memory, and then you can access the metadata or attributes of objects off of that. This guy will also update dynamically if something changes. Not that that particularly matters, but off of him you can get a lot of extra nodes like get asset by object path. Here we can use this to get the textures. So I have in my material that I want to hook up, I can get to it this way. I have 3 textures: base color, normal, and our channel packed map. And I'll leave this guy up because we'll reference, well, I'll open him later, but we'll reference these names in a moment. So first we want to get the textures that are associated with it. And as I said, my naming convention is T underscore the texture name, which will correspond with the material name, and then underscore the texture type. So since we know that we have the base material name, assuming that your naming convention has your texture follow your material name that they match, we can get our current material name, and then we can append, and we'll put it in the center with an input on either side, T underscore and underscore BC for our base color, and then do another one for normal, and I'm using ORM for my channel packed map. Great. Now in get asset by object path, it takes an object path. And an object path is basically the same as a path name. So what we can do to get that off of these guys, so we know the names of the textures that we want, so now we just have to figure out where they are. If I take get directory, our auto material asset, plug that in there, this should return just the directory we're importing to, and assuming that we are importing to the directory where the textures live, we can append, add a couple of inputs here. Remember, it is the directory slash asset name dot asset name. And I'll do that for each of these. Great. And then for this first one, plug that in there. I'm going to drag all of this down a little bit to format a little better. And then we're going to copy this guy twice because we have 3 textures. And I'll plug this into each of these. And we'll plug these in. Oops. All right. So now we have the return value for each of these, and this should return the asset data for those textures. So off of one of these, we're going to type get asset, and that'll get the actual texture that's there. And we're going to do this a couple times. Cool. Then we're going to cast to texture because we need to access that it is a texture. And again, do that for each of them. All right, so now we have access to the textures. Going to comment this section as get textures. The order I did these in, I put my channel packed map last. Off of this guy, we also want to get whether or not it is set to sRGB. Off of this same texture, if it is set to sRGB, we're going to turn it off. If it isn't, then we don't really care. Oops, I want to reroute. All right. Then we're going to get the current replacement material. Stored that out earlier. We're going to set material instance texture parameter value. Both of these will plug in. And we're going to grab each of our textures that we casted to. So first this should be the base color. So, whoops, I closed that. On here we just need to know this is base color map, that's what I put it to. So whatever you choose for this texture parameter name, need to go in here. And I will do this 2 more times. And be sure to plug in the current instance material variable to each of them, and each of our textures that we casted to will then go into the value. Cool. So I'm going to grab all these and slide them over. And this we're going to comment as set textures to current replacement material instance. All right, and then finally, on the ORM texture, or the channel pack texture, which is last, we just went to save loaded asset. We changed a value on it, so we're just going to save it. All right. Over here, I forgot to change this to normal map. Make sure that these are typed correctly. And just double checking my names. Normal map, ORM map. I need this turned on, and import. Cool. Okay, so now we have our materials generated, and they have the correct textures plugged into them. Now, we just have to attach them to the mesh and get rid of the old ones. So again, I'm going to delete these. I'm going to close that. Come back to our editor script. Next, off of here, we need one more in our sequence for each material. I should comment this for each material. So then down here, I'm going to cast to static mesh. We're going to get our auto material asset. Off of the as static mesh output, we're going to set material. Going to get our current replacement material. And here's where the array index that we stored out earlier should come in. These should line up. For the first index, which is 0, that should correspond to the index that is 0 on the material index. And do all of this, and so on, all the way up until we're done. Then, off of our current replacement material, we're going to save loaded asset. We've created a material. We should be saving it. And finally, the same for our static mesh. All right. So just to recap, we got the materials, and then for each material, we've extracted the name, created a material to replace it. Based on the name, we went and found the textures, and casted to them. Made sure the channel packed map had its correct settings. We've put the textures into the corresponding texture parameters of our material, and then we've saved the texture, our channel packed map, if we did change it. The only if dirty If you end up changing it, it'll save. You can untick this and it'll always save it. So this last bit here, I'm just going to comment replace material on mesh and save. Cool. So compile and save. I'm going to run this again. Bring it in, import. All right. Now our cube has the materials on it. The only last thing to do here is to get rid of these two old materials. And that's super easy. On this sequence earlier, just comment this, store mesh for algorithm for each mesh. On the last output of this sequence, we can come down, put a reroute node here. And luckily, we still have that array from earlier, the materials for auto material asset, which is the materials that imported. If we get that, we can just delete loaded assets, and we're done. Perfect. So now, again, if I run this, make sure that is checked, grab my asset and bring it in. There we go. And again, just to prove it's got the two materials on it. All right. So there we go. We now have a material that we can choose from, and you can choose other materials and put in here. The only thing to remember is that the texture parameter values have to be the same name. So the only difference is, I'm going to show you this version that I've had that I was tinkering with. If you can do the same thing for a skeletal mesh. There's just a couple of differences. You need to create a skeletal material array. You're going to clear it at the start, so that way then the next skeletal mesh that comes in, you're not using the previous skeletal mesh's materials. You're going to cast a skeletal mesh. And then the store materials, you have a for each loop, and for each you want to, off the cast to skeletal mesh, you want to get its skeletal materials. And for each material in the skeletal material array, you're going to add those to your material for auto mat asset. These come out with kind of a different object. They don't come out like with the object reference itself. They come out with a struct, which is going to be the material and then the material slot name. So I've also created an array, and we just add to that. And since you're doing these in the same iteration of the for loop, they should line up with indexes. The only other big thing is here. I'll come back to this in just a second. I don't set the parent here after creating the material. I actually have a function so you can choose what kind of material it is. But again, I'll come back to that in just a second. So after we set grab the textures, plug them into the texture parameters that they go on the material instance. In order to get the materials onto the object, you have to grab that skeletal material array that we cleared at the very beginning. Here we're going to add to it. We're going to get the current material that we make, and we're also going to take the array index to get the slot name. And then this guy here should start populating for each material. And then afterwards, we'll take that array, cast to the skeletal mesh, and set its skeletal material array to this new one that we built, and all of your materials should attach. Okay, so then here, as I said that I'd bring this up later, the create by keyword function, it's actually down here, but normally, so previously in the static mesh one, you would have the set material instance parent. Characters tend to be a bit more complex. They'll have a clothing material, a skin material, a hair material, an eye material, right? So instead, we just create a custom event that we call here, and then on that, we pick up keywords in the material name. You don't actually have to do any of this. This is pretty workflow based or personal to your workflow. I'm using keywords in the material, like if it contains hair, so m underscore character underscore hair. If it contains hair, then the replacement will be a hair material. If it contains eye, the replacement will be, or the parent will be an eye material, and so on. You can skip the branch at the end here if you wanted to make sure that no matter what, they got onto a material. Or you could do all branches and then end with a print that to let you or your artist know, hey, it didn't have a keyword, you should republish the asset. Anyways, that does it. I hope you guys find this helpful.